Thank you, Chairman, and it's good to be here. And it's nice to be in a position to, these turbulent times, to compare and contrast the calm and serenity down on the farm with the raging turbulence in the wider economy. So I hope that brings you some feeling of how well-being. Basically, I took the opportunity myself to go back in time to see what has been happening over all those years since we joined the European Union. So the paper itself is rather long, so I'm going to skim over it very rapidly so as to leave an opportunity for discussion afterwards. So first of all, to look at what we're going to cover in this paper, sorry, back again, the changing role of agriculture in the economy, the main policy developments and output income trends, the changing structure and performance of the sector, the prospects and challenges which lie ahead, especially regarding Harvest 2000 and the forthcoming reform of the Common Agricultural Policy. I might say at the outset that the sector has received considerable attention over the years in research studies and publications, etc., etc. These publications always seem to stress the unrealised potential of the agricultural economy over the years. Even though agriculture has shrunk, as we'll demonstrate later on, they still remain a very powerful lobby in society, and they always seem to box way above their weight in terms of attracting public attention. So, going on to look at our first slide, the role of agriculture in the economy, changing role. As you know, as with every other sector and every other developed country, those three aggregates have inexorably declined. First of all, with regard to GNP, it declined from about 18% in 1973 to roughly slightly over 2% last year. With regard to exports, they've fallen as a percent of total exports from 40% in 73 to about 77% last year. Now, because in terms of their significance to net inflows in the economy, because of the lower import content of agri-food exports and the low levels of profit repatriation from processing firms, its contribution to net inflows of money to the economy is somewhat greater. With regard to the labour force, it has declined from 25% in the very early 70s to about 5% at the present time. When we joined the European Union, we had about 263,000 people in the farm labour force. Now, that has declined to roughly 100,000 in recent years, and the latest CSO labour force figures indicate that that has fallen to about 85,000. And we don't seem to see any effect of the recession on those numbers yet anyway. Looking at the policy evolution since we joined the Union, I hope that's fairly clear enough. This is taken from David Harvey, who in turn took it from another source. As you know, in the early years of EU membership, we were concerned with food security, improving productivity, stabilising markets, and of course income support. Then in our early years, of course, they were very buoyant in terms of incomes. We had the process of going to the EU common price level through the transitional process, and then the annual prices were increasing anyway, so it was a huge buoyant period for the agricultural economy, and there were dramatic increases in incomes in those particular years. Then the crisis year set in with lower, with limits in production being imposed in the 1984 milk quota. It was an era of what they call prudent price policies and co-responsibility levies. It was the era of the huge surpluses. Some of the geographical features of the CAP at the time were the butter and beef mountains and the wine lakes, which people perhaps almost have forgotten about at the present time. And then we headed into the time when the 1992 reform was introduced. First of all, to prepare us for international trade. There were discussions on the Uruguay round at that particular time. So we were preparing for that process, and we were trying to lower our prices so as to make agreement with the other way around easier. So the 1992 reform, the McSherry reform, introduced lower prices and direct supports. And that was the first major policy adjustment apart from the 1984 super levy introduction since the beginning of the Common Agricultural Policy. In the Agenda 2000 reform, the price reductions were deepened and widened in the McSherry reform. We had lower prices introduced and an increase in direct payments, and more of an emphasis on rural development and the accompanying measures such as the REPS, the Less Favoured Areas Scheme, and forestry. Then the 2003 Luxembourg review came a bit earlier than expected, and this introduced the most dramatic adjustment to the Common Agricultural Policy since inception, in the form of the single farm payment. So from now on, payments were to be decoupled from production. Farmers received their entitlements on the basis of what they received in the reference period 2000 to 2002. And the Luxembourg Agreement also put more emphasis on cross-compliance as a basis for receiving payments, much more emphasis on the environment, etc., etc. Then later on in 2008, you had a more minor reform in the form of the 2008 health check, which continued the process of decoupling from production. And that particular reform also put an end to the milk quotas beginning in the year 2015. There are some minor adjustments as well, which are not as significant as the ones that I've mentioned. So since we joined the European Union then in 1973, we had one period where a freedom to farm policy was in place until 1984. And in fact, since 2005, we have that freedom to farm policy with the exception of the dairy quota, which, as I said, will be abolished in 2015. So we want to say a little more then about the evolution of output and its character since we joined the Union as well. Basically, since those very early days, the overall enterprise mix and pattern of farming has changed little in the agricultural economy. Despite the ebbs and flows in prices and markets and incomes, we still basically have the same mix of so much cattle, so much milk, so much pigs, so much cereals, etc., etc. And of course, the two dominant enterprises now and then, and always were almost, cattle and milk production, accounting for up to 70% of total output. So we had a good start beginning in, forward? No, but just back for a moment. We had a good start in the beginning of our membership of the European Union, when output expanded fairly rapidly, and especially in the milk sector. In the first 10 years of membership, the milk output expanded by up to 70%, which was unprecedented. Some other enterprises went into decline, but barley and beef production also expanded slightly. So that good start continued through the 80s, and by 1990, the volume of gross agricultural output had expanded by 50%. However, in the 90s, things began to stabilize somewhat, and the trend has been really downwards in the past decade or so. And last year, in 2009, the volume of agricultural output was somewhat less than it was 20 years ago in 1990. Perhaps what is a bit more disturbing is the fact that net value added, in real terms, is somewhat lower now than it was 10 years ago. That net value added is output less inputs. In 2009, it was about 30% less than it was in 2000, which is quite disturbing. And in the past 2 years in particular, while there has been a downward, quite a significant downward adjustment to agricultural output, there wasn't a corresponding decline in agricultural inputs. So to some extent, it's rather worrying. I want to say just one brief word about competitiveness. Some work that's been done recently for the Department of Agriculture and Food indicates that our competitive position in the agricultural sector is somewhat weaker than it was in the decade previously, especially when you take the land inputs and labour inputs into consideration. It has fallen further behind. So let's look then briefly at, I'm going to summarise those in a chart later on, about looking at the highs and lows in farm incomes over the years. I think one farm leader of the time described what was happening in incomes in farming in the 70s as a bonanza for farming. And in fact, I used to use that word so frequently that I'm never sure some of the times whether the word is bonanza or bonanza. So I better drop it totally from my lexicon. So in those early years of ESC membership, there was a dramatic increase in farm incomes. And then we went into the 80s, where we had rampant inflation. We had budgetary problems in the EU. We had a reduced ability to win green pound evaluations, and things went a bit topsy-turvy for 5 or 6 years. But in the late 80s then, after the introduction of the super levy, things did pick up. We had a green pound evaluation, I think, in 1986. And the world markets were fairly buoyant in the late 80s and early 90s. And we did get further green pound evaluation in 1993. But in the late 90s and beginning onto the year 2002, we went through a rather torrid patch in respect to agricultural incomes. We had weak markets, we had low prices, we had the dreaded foot and mouth disease and the BSE. So, and even despite a huge increase in direct payments, which we'll come to later on, there was about a 15% decline in nominal incomes over that period. In the last decade, then, we've had even more dramatic fluctuations in farm incomes. We had a very good period in 2000, 2004, 2005, 2006. That's because of the introduction of the single farm payment in 2005. There was a once-off overlap between the payment of the old schemes and the introduction of the new schemes in December 2005. So we had quite a significant increase in farm incomes of the order of about 25% over those couple of years. And indeed up until 1997. We all remember 2007 rather, when world prices for cereals and milk increased dramatically. And that was reflected in agricultural prices in Ireland and also in agricultural incomes. So we had a very good year in that in 2007 as well. However, in the last 2 years, 2008 and 2009, farm incomes have fallen by about 40%. And they were back last year about 20% in nominal terms, about 20 years in nominal terms. So that was a significant jolt to the good period of incomes which we had experienced in 2002 to 2007. Just saying a word about that people often talk or compare wages and incomes in agriculture with the non-farm economy. Over the years, the comparator which is used is comparing the income per labour unit in agriculture with that in average industrial earnings. Over the years, the average per labour income unit in agriculture was about 50 to 60% of that of industrial earnings, but that fell to about 37%, an all-time low in 2009. So just to summarise, if this is coming up clearly enough, you can see the red line, which increased very gradually right up to about 1990, and it peaked at about 160 in relation to 173. But has been gradually in decline since the year 2000. Now stands about 145 versus 100 when we joined the union in 1973. Incomes, sorry, it's a bit faint there. You see that in the early years it increased quite a bit, up to about 20% in real terms, up to about 78, 79, and has been, just moving along with minor gyrations right up to the present time, and then it fell dramatically in 2008 and 2009. So that just summarises the overall position with regard to output and incomes. Just going to say a word about the role of direct payments here. As you know, in the early years of EU membership, farming mainly received support through private income support. And that changed with the introduction of, beginning with the McSherry reform in 1992 and thereafter in 2003, 2004, to direct payments compensating for price reductions. You see, just in that period, 1990 to 2009, in 1990, direct payments as a percent of farm income was about 25%. That increased to, look at my own figures here, I can see that, in 2003 to 75%, to 86% in 2006, to 90% in 2008, and 123%, would you believe, in the year 2009. In the trading year 2009 in agriculture, before we look at direct payments, the agricultural sector made a trading loss of almost 400 million. So if you take 400 million off the direct payments of almost 2 billion, you get 1.6 billion, which is the operating surplus or income in agriculture. So the influence of direct payments in farm income formation has become utterly dramatic in those years. For some systems of farming in particular, like beef, the income in beef farming is almost identical to the receipts in direct payments. So it's particularly critical in beef farming and also to a lesser extent in cereal farming. Moving on to farm structure, we're just saying here that there has been an unremitting change in the structure of agriculture with fewer and larger farms, specialisation and concentration of production, less employment and growth in part-time farming. And if you look at the trends over time, there's really no plateau or endpoint emerging at which change ceases to happen. It's just going on and on now. I presume at some stage it'll become asymptotic to the axis, but for the moment it's not there anyway. So looking briefly at holdings, the holdings in agricultural structure. Sorry, okay. You can see that the number of farms has declined from 171,000 in 1991 to 128,000 in 2007. In fact, there was a change in methodology in 1999, so in 1991, so it's very hard to compare the trends post-91 with pre-91. But roughly speaking, if the methodology which the CSO adopted in 1991 were to apply back retrospectively, the number of farms probably when we joined the European Union would have been about 200,000, and that's 128,000 roughly at the present time. The average decline in farm holdings is the order of 1.5%. It was somewhat greater in the 90s than in the last decade. Farm size has increased somewhat from 26 to 32 hectares. Not as dramatic, but it reflects obviously the decline in the number of holdings. With respect to the number of the age structure of farmers, this, if anything, has got slightly worse. We had the proportion under 44 has declined from 33% in 1991 to 25% in 2007, while the proportion over 65 has increased from, well, not dramatically, from 23% to 25%. Just say one word also about, which I haven't covered here, but it's in the paper, about renting and fragmentation. Renting by farms now account for about 18 to 19% of the total area farmed in the country, up from about 13% 15 years previously. But fragmentation, another feature of structure in agriculture, has got worse, if any. There are now, in the Farm Structure Survey of 2007, each holding has supposed to have 5.3 fragments as opposed to 2 fragments 20 years earlier. So in that sense, it's a disimprovement. One word about part-time farming. It is an international phenomenon. And in Ireland, part-time farming accounted for, or the people on off-farm jobs accounted for about 23% in 1990 to 42% in 2006. Now, with the recession, that's coming back slightly. Last year, the National Farm Survey estimated that about 35% of landholders had an off-farm job. One of the things which might be considered to be disturbing from the point of view of agricultural development is the very big increase, the corresponding increase in the area of our land resources which are in the hands of part-time farmers. I reckon that about 20 years ago, 25 years ago, about 1/5 of the land used in the country was in the hands of part-time farmers. I think that's probably gone to about 1/3 at the present time. And I'm just mentioning that because many people will consider that that has negative implications for growth and productivity, as part-time farmers do not farm as intensively as their full-time counterparts. Getting on, sorry, backwards. Skip here. Sorry, this is a very table, but I wanted to include the figures so some of you can peruse them afterwards, because sometimes it's more striking to see the actual figures than the indices. But briefly, what I want to say is that we didn't have any land price series produced by the CSO until the year 1990. And in the previous years, Paul Kelly of An Fearst Linthish and Bob O'Connor of the ESRI afterwards did construct a land price series, which was very useful indeed. And that is just, and the CSO figures are also reflected here. Just as a matter of interest, the estimated land price in 1970 was 524 euro per hectare. And in the CSO series, which took up after Bob O'Connor's series finished, that had reached 16,261 euro per hectare. The biggest increase in any of the decades was in the 70s, when there was a tenfold increase from 1970 to 1979. Land prices fluctuated quite a bit in the 80s, but they rose again in the 90s. And in the year 2000, they were about double that of in 1990. Now, the CSO series discontinued, or was discontinued in the spring of 2005. So we have no official figures for the following 2 years. Now, the Irish Farmers Journal, through the work of Shirley Bustede, they came back into the market, if you like, for land price indices, and they produced figures for 2007, 2008, 2009. Now, you can see the jump there, but in 2004 and 2007, where, according to the CSO, land prices were about 16,000 in 2004, and Shirley Bustede has them at 50,500 in the year 2007. Since that, of course, land prices, according to her series, has declined by about 50%. So the CSO gave up their series of land prices because they were unhappy that it was reflecting the reality in the marketplace. I think they may resume that land price series very soon. But I have question marks around those years. But suffice it to say, there was a dramatic increase in land prices over 30 years, over 40 years, I suppose, now having declined by 50% in the past 2 years. And of course, I suppose the years from 2005, 6 and 7 were also very vigorous in the land market. And I presume as I pointed out there on the right-hand column, the amount of land traded in the market and the huge decline, especially in the 90s and the last decade, probably has been a major stimulant to land price as well. Obviously, whereas farmers were into the land in the market for land at those high prices, there was a huge, voracious demand, one might say, from professional, business and speculative interests in those years, which drove the land sky high. As a matter of fact, you see there, in 1978, that was the year in which the biggest area of land was traded in the country, about almost 100,000 hectares. And that had fallen to about 6,000 hectares in the year 2030. So I think that particular chart could be a subject for a lot of discussion later on, and it might deserve a paper on its own. Briefly, with respect to land use, hasn't been a lot of change in that regard, except with the 6 to 8% increase in forestation. I think there's about 10% of the land was taken out of agriculture and diverted to forestry in the period from about 1990 to last year. So moving on then to more recent developments to publication of Food Harvest 2020. First of all, a word about the recovery in farm incomes this year. There has been probably some improvement of the order of 20 or 25%. So I think the farmers are a bit upbeat than they were a year or two ago. Milk prices have recovered appreciably. Cereal prices are extremely high at the present time. And we do expect that recovery to continue into next year. But I think it might be 3 or 4 years before we get back to the level of incomes which we had in the peak year, or the most recent peak year of 2007. Looking at Food Harvest 2000, the publication of the Food Harvest 2000, the overarching targets there, as indicated as an increase in the value of primary output by 2020 in the sector of the order of 1.5 billion, which would represent a 33% increase over the 2007-2009 average. An increase in value added in the sector of 3 billion, a 40% increase over 2008, and an export target of 12 billion, a 42% increase over 2007-2009 by the year 2020. The department expects that the forward thrust to be given to this programme will be a smart, green and sustainable trust in the coming years. Now, just a few comments about the document. There is no breakdown of the contributions of each sector given and how much growth and prices contribute to the target. There is no breakdown given of the breakdown of growth and prices. But we do not anticipate, and neither do they anticipate, any major change in the pattern of output or product mix, no different to what it was in the past to any great extent. They do, in fact, mention that there will be major changes for the dairy, beef and pig, there isn't a new enterprise coming into agriculture called pigment, no, that should be pig meat sectors. But probably the most dramatic forecast or expectation which they present is that of a 50% increase in dairy output by the year 2020. In some respects, it's very difficult to see this being realised. I was just comparing what the situation was in 1983 before the dairy quota was imposed on us, and what the situation is today. In 1983, we had about 63,000 dairy farmers, and today we have 18,500. And the land in the possession of those people in 1983 was about 1.7, 1.8 million acres. There was that amount of land associated with the dairy farmers of that day. I reckon that at the present time, there's only about 1 million hectares associated with the present core of dairy farmers in the country. So in that sense, that represents a constraint on realising the 50% target. Also, the rate of price increases in that very expansionary period when we realised a 50% increase, or 50 to 70, depending on what year you take, in dairy expansion in the first year of EU membership. I think that milk prices actually tripled in nominal terms that first year. There is no way in which milk prices are going to expand even a fraction of that in the next 4 or 5 years, I imagine. So that's another constraint. And I did mention also that about the land availability to dairy farmers is much less. Now, they can gain access to land, of course, through leasing or purchase, but that's much easier said than done. So I think that will be a constraint on the realisation of that dairy output target by the year 2020. So something which I'll refer to briefly later on, land structure and mobility is a major constraint on dairy farming unless we gain access to more land, or farmers gain access to more land by one means or another. Going on to the Common Agricultural Policy after 2013, I'm just setting the context for that reform. And just by mentioning that in 2008 and 2009, Ireland received 1.284 million and 1.705 billion in EU agricultural receipts, of which the single farm payment alone was about 1.3 billion, which represents 2/3 of those total direct payments received by farmers. When I mentioned it was almost 2 billion for the year 2009, the single farm payment of 1.3 billion represents 2/3 of that. So that is the context against which the negotiations on the Common Ag proposals will take place in the coming 2 or 3 years. In the communication to the Council, entitled Meeting the Food, Natural Resources and Territorial Challenges of the Future, it is mentioned that all potential options for the future of the CAP imply changes in the current instruments of the CAP. And they reckon that among the most controversial future instruments for the reform of the CAP are some necessary adaptations, and I'm quoting, to the system of direct payments, where the criteria for those adaptations might be economic in the sense of supporting incomes, or environmental in the sense of the provision of public goods in the coming years. So, as stated in the document, the objectives of the future CAP are viable food production, including compensation for natural handicaps, sustainable development of natural resources, etc., and balanced territorial development to promote diversification and rural diversity. In that communication, 3 broad policy options are presented. I think you have the communication there as well. It can be circulated afterwards. Option 1 was to introduce further gradual changes to the current policy framework. In this option, there will be limited improvements in specific areas, like more equity in direct payments as between member states. And this option would probably represent continuity and stability with the current CAP, thus facilitating, as I would say, long-term planning for operators. Option 2 is more dramatic, where they think it would capture the opportunity for reform and make major overhauls of the policy more sustainable and more targeted measures. This option would imply greater spending efficiency and greater focus on the EU value added. Option 3 would represent, sorry, I'm not forward enough there, would represent a much more radical reform of the CAP, with the main focus on environmental and climate change, and gradually, over time, moving away totally from income support and most of the market measures. And at the same time, this option would probably provide a clearer financial focus on environmental and climate change through the Rural Development Policy Framework. So each of those options has associated, I'm focusing here mainly on the direct payment feature of it, which is the one that's the most controversial, but each of those options has associated market and rural development proposals. Now, some of the crucial issues from an Irish standpoint are mentioned here. Obviously, the size of the budget, number one. There is certainly a lot of opposition to any increase in the forthcoming financial perspective, 2014 to 2020. If anything, the budget for agriculture may decline, because other objectives of the CAP may be pushed more to the forefront, like cohesion. I was very surprised to hear that Poland are arguing strongly for a stronger cohesion policy in the forthcoming financial perspective. Probably more emphasis on innovation and more impetus on R&D as well. Then the whole question arises, will the new member states demand a larger share than they did in the period 2007 to 2013? Because they feel hard done by from the guarantee fund, which is the market and price support fund of the CAP, although they've done somewhat better from the Pillar 2, the Rural Development Fund. Then there's the whole question of the change from the historic method of payments, or model of payments, to another model. As you know, if in the case of Ireland, all our payments are based on the reference period 2000 to 2002, on what they call the historic model. But there is a lot of pressure. There will be an awful lot of pressure, even in the negotiations, the discussions leading up to the formulation of the communication. There were a lot of discussions on whether the historic model could be maintained in the future. And I think the majority of people would argue that it probably will not be maintained. But if you change then from that historic model to what we call a flat rate model, you might be assigning a somewhat higher priority to the public good objective of the cap and less to the food production approach, because the Commission are still insisting that the food production approach is a very valid basis for giving support to the sector. Looking at possible adjustments as far as we're concerned, one of the major adjustments that's being mentioned is the EU flat rate adjustment. Every member state, every hectare and every member state getting the same payment. The average for the community at the present time is about 270 hectares per hectare of agricultural land, 270 euro rather, and Ireland gets a slightly above average, 315 euro or so per hectare under that system. In terms of the amount per beneficiary, Ireland receives somewhat over 10,000 per annum in the single farm payment, whereas the EU average is about 6,000. But if an EU-wide flat rate were adopted, then obviously Ireland would be a major loser of the order of 10-15% or so. That's the rough estimate at the present time. Another variant would be the adoption of a regional flat rate with a given national or regional allocation. If we were to adopt that, or if that were to be imposed in Ireland, then it would mean a transfer of funds from the large farms to small farms, and from the south and east of the country to the north and west. So I think these sets of negotiations are going to be extremely important, and they will be extremely controversial when the time comes. Another adjustment which is mentioned is a cap on payments across member states. That could still be a runner, but it might be taken in conjunction with one of the other adjustments which has been mentioned. So what approach will Ireland adopt in negotiations? Obviously, the status quo is the preferred option on the part of all the farming organisations. But in the heat of the hunt, I think there will have to be some compromise. And perhaps some system or other can be devised, I'm sure could be devised, to differentiate payments in such a way which would minimise the gains and losses and leave the overall distributional effect of the adjustment as neutral as possible for Ireland. I'm sure that's the way the main farming organisations would want it. I think that's the way the politicians will want it. But whether we'll achieve that is another matter. So I just want to a few concluding remarks to hope I haven't gone over my time, Mr. Chairman, too much. Okay. Basically what I'm saying is that the future of the agricultural sector in Ireland is no more or less challenging than for any other sector of the economy. In fact, it might be more insulated from the current woes than any other group in society, as there are at least reasonable market prospects for the agri-food sector. And the farm labour force, if you like, is mainly self-employed, even if its remuneration is largely residual and for some rather meagre in nature. However, we must point out also that in the short and medium term, it may well have to do with much less support from both national and community sources. One of the factors which I did mention in the main paper, and I want to bring it up again in the concluding remarks, is that one of the factors which I'm mentioning is, which is inhibiting growth in the sector in the next 3 or 4 years, is the sluggish performance of agricultural output, with little prospect of expansion in any meaningful way until the year 2014. And one of the factors which is impeding growth is the increase in live cattle exports at the present time, and the downward trend in cattle numbers, partially attributed to the decoupled system of payments introduced in the year 2005. Another point I would like to make in conclusion is there seems to be an almost overweening dependence on market prices to effect improvements in aggregate incomes, rather than improving efficiency and productivity. There is still an extraordinary degree of variation in farm performance between the upper and lower cohorts of producers. And while these gaps have been highlighted ad nauseum, they still remain stubbornly resistant to change. And one other disturbing thing is that in many respects, the structure of farming, as I mentioned earlier, has just improved in recent decades. An ever-increasing proportion of the utilised agricultural area is now in the hands of part-time farmers. And while this may help to maintain the rural economy, it does have negative implications for agricultural development and may hinder rationalisation and land mobility. Land fragmentation has also increased, the age structure has deteriorated, and there seems to be a general torpor, I think, on a wide swath of dry stock farmers in particular. And finally, lest that I not appear to be unduly pessimistic, The ending, I think, of the dairy quota policy will reinvigorate the sector and restore a new dynamism which has been lacking for about 30 years. Let's hope that that dynamism will become infectious and that agriculture will remain a resilient sector of our economy and a bastion of security and stability in these troubled times. Thank you.
Thank you.